Well, hi and welcome everyone. I'm Jean-Marc Leclerc, Director of EU Government and Regulatory Affairs at IBM and co-director of the IBM Policy Lab. Thank you all for joining us today for a new Policy Lab live event where we'll discuss global approaches to AI policymaking. Now, with the IBM Policy Lab, which is a global platform for discussing some of today's most pressing tech policy issues, such as the regulation of artificial intelligence, we released earlier in the year a policymaker's guide to foundation models, which outline policy recommendations on how best to regulate AI and generative AI. And so today I'm joined by an all-star lineup of global policy experts to explore the topic. So joining me today, we have IBM's Chief Privacy and Trust Officer, Christina Montgomery. Christina oversees IBM's privacy program, compliance and strategy on a global basis, and she also chairs IBM's AI Ethics Board, which is the team responsible for the governance and decision-making process for IBM's AI ethics, policies, and practices. And Christina is also a member of the US Chamber of Commerce AI Commission, the AI Governance Advisory Board, Advisory Committee, NIAC, and the AI Governance Advisory Board for the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We also have Kai Zenner, who joined us from the European Parliament. He's the head of office and digital policy advisor to MEP Axel Voss. Kai is a digital enthusiast who focuses on AI, data, and digital transformation in general, and is currently involved in the political negotiations on the EU AI Act. And finally, Max Katz, who is a legislative fellow in the office of US Senator Martin Heinrich. Max works on science, technology, energy policies for the senator, and prior to that, Max was a senior solutions architect at NVIDIA, and he worked with various US government organizations on the deployment of supercomputing systems. So first, I'll moderate a discussion with the speakers, and hopefully we have time for an open Q&A session with the audience. By the way, if you'd like to submit a question to the panelists, you can enter that in the chat. So with that, let's get started. So first of all, a question to our three panelists. When we launched this Policy Lab in 2018, one of our core principles was that artificial intelligence should be regulated based on the level of risk associated with a certain application of AI. And we call that precision regulation. So 4 years later to now in 2023, at a time when governments are really seriously looking at how to approach policymaking for AI, I want to ask you, what does it mean for an AI application to be high risk, to be low risk? How is that different? And what should be the policy approaches and how should it differ between the two? I'm going to start with you, Christina.
Hi, thanks, Jean-Marc. So I think it's really important to note from the onset that AI as a technology is not inherently good or inherently bad. It's really in how you use it. AI is essentially software. And a recommendation algorithm in something like a credit determination tool or sentencing recommendations is very different in terms of its impact and the context around it than, say, a recommendation algorithm that is helping you to choose the next book that you might be interested in, nor the next movie based on things you've read prior or watched prior. Pervasive low-risk uses of AI are very common today, and applying the same rigor to, from a regulatory policy perspective, to every use, including low-risk uses of AI, is really likely to hamper innovation. But at the same time, there are really significant high-risk uses that need to be regulated. So it's about getting that balance.
Thanks, Christina. Max, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks to IBM for inviting me. I'll clarify ahead of my comments that the comments are my own, not necessarily those of the senator. But I think that when we think about high-risk use cases, we're really thinking about areas where there's a significant risk to an individual's civil rights or their access to essential services such as healthcare or the ability to get a loan in the finance industry, or their ability to generally participate in the economy in an equal opportunity sense. I also think that high-risk use cases involve cases where AI is connected to critical infrastructure. If AI is involved in driving our cars or running the power grid, it's very important that we think about that as a potentially high-risk use case, because lives could be at stake depending on how well and how robustly those systems work. And so it's important to think about this both in the context of risks to individuals and serious risk to those, as well as broader risk to society. And if you have AI systems that, if they fail, could pose a public safety or national security threat, that's also pretty important. And when it comes to high-risk use cases, you really want to make sure that there is a pretty significant level of rigor in the evaluation of the systems before they're deployed. For low-risk use cases, I think it's more appropriate to ensure that the government is providing best standards for how to evaluate and deploy those systems, but not necessarily require that from companies to allow the innovation that Christina was talking about to flourish.
Thanks, Max. Kai, what do you make of this?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with basically everything that has been said so far. And maybe I can link our discussion a little bit to the AI Act and what there works quite good and where maybe it's going a little bit away from the risk-based approach. Because now, starting with the good things, the AI Act is being drafted in the spirit that we are talking about, having those, as you all know, having those 4 different risk criteria, prohibitions, high-risk AI systems, those that require a little bit more of transparency, and the last layer, the non-high-risk AI systems. Again, based on what my co-panelists said, this is the way we should regulate AI. I think we all agree. The problem with the AI Act is that and it was also mentioned by both of my co-panelists, is that AI is rather different depending on the context. Even within a sector, there are a lot of extremely different use cases. And this is a big challenge for the AI Act, even though it has this risk-based approach. For example, let's take one of the high-risk categories in the employment area. Many cases there are indeed a high risk, but there are also some applications that are maybe even reducing the risk. There are also other use cases where, for example, it makes sense to demand human oversight. But in another high-risk use case, human oversight or human intervention could even be harmful. And this is then one thing that is becoming rather tricky for a legislator, for lawmakers, to really find the right balance between general rules, even in a risk-based approach, but that those general rules do make sense for all those different cases that you would classify maybe under a high risk category. And yeah, there it's really then important to find the right wording. And again, to make it generally enough, but also, of course, not create too many loopholes. And this is actually one of the big reasons why the AI Act negotiations take so long, because yeah, we are still working on the right wording, for example, on prohibitions or on high-risk use cases.
Well, thanks, Kai. We'll get back to the EU AI Act, but I would like for us to be to go specifically on the issue of foundation models. So let me turn back to you, Christina and Max. So foundation models, what are they? They are models that use large data sets, machine learning techniques to apply information learned about one situation to another situation. And with the advancement of publicly available foundation models like ChatGPT, we see policymakers looking closely at foundation models and looking to address this type of AI in legislation. So in your view, how should governments, policymakers, and industry address foundation models in particular? Christina, back to you.
Sure. I mean, I think, in the same way that we're advocating for a risk-based approach and to regulate the use, not the technology itself, we advocate for the same thing with respect to foundation models, that policymakers should maintain a technology neutral approach to foundation models. And so that means that any regulations imposed on them should be proportionate and technically feasible, because what we'll find if you overregulate in this space, you will essentially risk cementing, sort of the market in the hands of those companies that can most readily comply with the regulations, and not support a vibrant open ecosystem. So importantly, recognizing the different roles that providers and creators and developers play with respect to foundation models versus users, encourage different responsibilities on the part of developers, like sharing information, documentation to enable deployers to comply with the act, but not throwing away the risk-based approach. So potentially for foundation models, if you're going to focus on regulating them alone, one of our suggestions have been to draw criteria from the DSA in Europe to classify, for example, very large online platforms and only those that capture systems in direct contact with over 45 million users, versus the very many foundation models that businesses potentially are using today, which aren't touching people and aren't very, very high risk in and of themselves. Not to say not to say creators of foundation models shouldn't have responsibility, as I mentioned. They absolutely should, and they should be those responsibilities that are technically feasible in sort of the upstream environment. So again, coming back to the basics, be sure to continue to focus on use and develop regulation that is technology neutral.
Thanks, Christina. Max, what do you think?
This is certainly an area that U.S. Congress is thinking a lot about recently, and it's one that we still have to learn a fair amount about. I certainly agree with Christina that in cases where we can clearly identify a use case that a foundation model is being applied to and turned into a specific product, then we should continue to have that be covered by the kind of general risk-based framework that I hope that we're able to set up here in the United States. That being said, these foundation models do have interesting properties that they're useful for a wide variety of tasks, but also we don't necessarily know what all of those tasks are when the foundation model is first developed. And when we put that out there and the community is able to use these models, we learn lots of interesting things about what these systems are useful for. And so we've seen with GPT-3 and GPT-4 that there's lots of interesting use cases that the community has uncovered that we wouldn't necessarily have predicted when the model was first released. And that has some interesting properties for governance. And I think the most important one is that we need to be flexible with our approach and think about how to monitor what's going on with these systems and then update our governance strategy based on what we're learning. And so I think for us, a core principle in Congress will be, how do we set up a structure that allows us to evaluate both the capabilities and the risks of these systems as they're evolving, because that will really inform the kind of governance strategy that we need to take. There are individuals who are saying that these systems can be useful for democratizing access to a wide range of knowledge, and that does seem to be true so far. And a lot of that knowledge would be very useful and will empower individuals to engage in a wide range of economic activities. But it also empowers and democratizes access to not necessarily beneficial information to a wide range of people. And so when you see claims about these systems empowering individuals to build weapons of mass destruction by making it much easier to access scientific knowledge that they didn't have before, that's a very serious claim, and it's something that we have to dig into, right? And as someone who believes in evidence-based policymaking, it feels to me like the most important thing is to have a structure in the US government that can analyze claims like these, understand how real the risks are from these systems, and then tailor our regulatory infrastructure based on that. If we find that these risks aren't there, then it certainly allows us to have a lighter touch than if we find that there are real national security risks from people having access to these systems. And so I think that's the conversation that we're having in Congress right now, and it will really inform the way the legislation goes over these next months and years.
Thanks, Max. Now to you, Kai. So I'm going to ask you about foundation models because you wrote about it. But last night, I know you went to bed quite late because we had the latest round of negotiations on the EU AI Act. So I have to ask you, what stage are we at? How are things going? What's been approved? What is still on the table? Can you shed a bit of light on what's going on?
Yes, sure. So yes, indeed, yesterday's political trilogue was going until 12 or 1 a.m. If you count all those informal talks afterwards with, then definitely until 1 a.m. In general, there are a lot of paragraphs and articles still open, a lot of technical work still required. The main stumbling points are the prohibitions, high-risk AI use cases, the AI office, governance, so as a third point. And as a fourth point, you mentioned it already, foundation models and also AI value chain, so obligations within the value chain, for example, when it comes to information sharing. We still also on the fourth topic, foundation model, have a lot of work to do, especially since Parliament and Council in their proposal did agree on a lot. Both wanted, again, to accelerate information sharing along the value chain. Both found it a bit tricky if you're only concentrating on the downstream provider, deployer, so companies that are, let's say, putting the final AI system together and placing it on the market as a high-risk AI system, for example, and the deployer, so company that is using those AI systems, if they would be the sole focus of the AI Act. Again, both of our understandings was that, well, at least upstream provider that or developers that are not really falling into the AI Act need to work closely together with those downstream actors. It's going a little bit to this GDPR concept of joint controllership and something similar. But if you are then going into details, Parliament and Council do also have a rather different approach. As a council is focusing on general purpose AI systems, so things that are already more downstream, and are then trying to make those systems almost all the time as a kind of high risk and let them face high risk obligations, even though the Commission should specify this, while the Parliament is going really upstream to the models, so the foundation models, and wanted to let those developers face certain obligations. And what was yesterday only decided is that both is not a 100% fit. Both would not really strike the right balance between promoting innovation in AI, would, on the other hand, also not really prevent those risks that we are scared about. And therefore, what we will probably do now is to take a kind of DSA approach, so to focus on the most, let's say, capable, powerful, dominant, or systemic foundation models that, similar to the DSA, have a very, very strong impact within the AI value chain and also on our society, and let them need to fulfill a longer list of requirements, but which are still rather high level, while all the rest of the foundation models, due to the fact that those foundation models will become a key part within the AI value chain, that all those developers need to fulfill certain documentation responsibilities. But when it comes to the details, also how you should qualify as one of those more risky foundation models, or what kind of obligations this top tier in this two-tier approach should face, all those details are completely unclear, and this will be one of the major topics in the next 4 weeks until Christmas that we need to discuss.
Thanks, Kai. I'm staying with you because you wrote on foundation models yourself, your personal views, but can you Can you explain what you describe as systemic models and how do you think they should be addressed in particular?
Yeah. So my proposal from, well, I wrote most of the stuff that the OECD published in July already in May, but then, yeah, I didn't have time to make the final review of it. What I propose there is going very closely in the direction of what was being decided yesterday. Also in this paper, I mentioned that it would be harmful for innovation, in my opinion, if we are now putting all foundation models in the scope of the AI Act. As my co-panelists were also saying, again, we want something risk-based, and foundation models, well, they do not have an intended purpose. So it would be really strange to use a product safety legislation which always centers on the intended purpose and suddenly force something that doesn't have an intended purpose to fulfill this product safety legislation piece. But what I then also concluded in my paper was that, well, again, similar to what was decided yesterday, those models probably, at least it's looking like it at the moment, will play a major role within the value chain, meaning that most of the downstream high-risk AI systems, for example, will integrate a foundation model, or will at least benefit from certain elements from a foundation model, for example, the output, and so on and so on. So to keep them completely out of our AI Act would lead systemically probably to some problems, especially again, if you now look from an economic or competition perspective, it would be rather tricky. And on the other hand, those foundation models, even though they do not have an intended purpose, have already certain risks. One thing that I concluded, therefore, was we should, and unfortunately it was not taken over by the European Parliament in our Article 28b, which was basically a Christmas tree of a lot of obligations that, in my opinion, could not really be fulfilled by normal foundation models, what would be smarter, in my opinion, would be not a risk assessment, but some kind of testing for foundation model provider combined with a strong documentation, which would then enable downstream actors to better understand foundation models, the things that they are maybe integrating in their high-risk AI systems, and because of the testing, making sure that those foundation models fulfill certain minimum criteria, let's say. This is actually something that OpenAI is already doing. If you are looking a little bit in the background of GPT-4 and ChatGPT, they are already doing some tests when it comes to certain cybersecurity risks, to certain biases, cases of discrimination. And on those really realistic risks of what a foundation model could trigger, those actors can already identify, mitigate against, and so on and so on. And I think if this is in the end the outcome in the AI Act, it would be basically good for everyone, even for those upstream foundation model developers. And maybe one last sentence on the thresholds and those companies that should fall in this category. Again, I said already, I think it's wise to look in the DSA and really focus on those dominant players that will be used in many downstream AI systems, and also are so often again used, but also have a so important role in our society in the end, that indeed, if there is, for example, a discriminatory data set in one of those foundation models, you could speak of systemic risks. So this, I think, would be a good way out, and probably in the end, well, in my publication, I think I put 10 models together, basically a bit gut feeling and research combined. But honestly, I do not expect more models in the end following under such a regulatory approach.
Thanks, Kai. So let's cross the Atlantic again. I'm going to you, Christina. I know you were in Ottawa in Canada not long ago. You talked to policymakers and the government there about safe adoption and regulation of AI. So do you mind giving us a high-level update on Canada's approach to AI policymaking and any insights from the trip you had there?
Yeah, I mean, just at a high level, like yesterday I spoke at the DX Summit in Canada. And, IBM has been working with the technology industry in Canada for a long time, and the North American tech ecosystem in general, with strategic investments in research and semiconductors and the like. So a very important point that I covered and that I cover with policymakers wherever I go is this point of interoperability in regulations. I think we have an opportunity now as a world to sort of align on general principles, risk-based approaches, and the like in regulation, and that is the direction that Canada is heading in. Canada has proposed a new bill, C-27, which modernizes their privacy regulation and introduces the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And so they very much are also focused on what are those high-risk uses, not regulating the technology itself, and then thinking about how that regulation comports with trust in government. So the conversation yesterday was with customers of IBM's, federal government procurement and the like in Canada. And so when they're deploying and thinking about digital transformation, how are they doing that in the way that's trusted? So there's very nice alignment between the policy making and then what is going to be required to digitally transform services for citizens across the world. So that's essentially what we talked about and emphasized again this point of interoperability.
Thank you. And to you, Max, because your office held a listening forum with Senators Schumer and Young not so long ago. So can you also share any insights from that session?
Yes, Senator Heinrich, as well as Senator Schumer and Rounds and Young, have been working together for the past 7 months or so in a bipartisan gang, as we're calling it in the Senate, to think about AI legislation and AI education for members of the Senate. And so we're holding a series of insight forums that are educating senators and Senate staff on the topics involved in AI. Our first one, our kickoff meeting, was last month, and it was well attended. We got a lot of interest in the general topic of U.S. government involvement in the regulation and innovation sides of AI. Our second event, second Insight Forum, was just yesterday, and it was focused on the topic of innovation. We had a wide range of attendees from labor, from civil society, from the tech industry, from venture capital. And so we've got a really diverse set of views on what is important for encouraging innovation in AI in the United States, and both in a transformational sense to find breakthroughs in the technology, as well as in a sustainable sense of finding what are the appropriate guardrails to place around this technology to make sure that the technology develops in a responsible way. There was a lot of, I think, interesting conversation yesterday, and there was general agreement that the U.S. government should be involved in this discussion, as we saw in the first forum. There was also a general consensus that there needs to be a significant U.S. investment in this technology at the public sector level. And a number that was cited by the National Security Commission on AI, which was a congressionally chartered task force that stood up a couple of years ago, they recommended that over time we build up to $32 billion of non-defense research and development spending in AI each year. Of course, that's significantly further from where we are now, but there was general agreement that that target is appropriate given the stakes of this technology and how much benefit could be delivered to Americans and to the world if we really dig in and invest in this technology. There's also agreement that data is a public good, and that sometimes an impediment to success in AI for the public good is that there just aren't sufficiently maintained publicly available data sets for people to do AI for biotechnology or for the energy sector. And so US investment in data infrastructure and computational infrastructure that's available to academics and to researchers is really important. And also there was a bit of discussion about what the ecosystem should look like for responsible innovation in this area. And so some strong arguments made that we really need a robust auditing and impact assessment ecosystem so that for the high-risk use cases that we're talking about, that companies can feel confident that their tools are ready to go before they're deployed in the public. And then you also want to make sure that they're, for the high-risk use cases, at least in some cases, you're going to want to continuously monitor these tools after they're deployed to make sure that they're still fit for purpose. And so that really requires a robust governance and auditing ecosystem to make that happen.
Thanks, Max, and thanks all for sharing your views and your insights on these topics. We have 15 minutes left in the conversation. I see we have quite a few questions in the chat, so let me have a look at the first one from Deborah. Do we need separate policies governing private commercial use and public use? That's from Deborah. Who wants to take this one?
I can maybe start and say that here in the European Union, as you saw, we decided for a horizontal approach that is including all in one piece. So the AI Act is applicable for the public sector, for law enforcement agencies, for private user, not so much, but commercial definitely, and even the private or the end user could potentially here and there be affected from it. I think in general, it's a good decision, at least for Europe, because we do not have the sectorial approach of the United States and that strong agencies, sectorial agencies. But one big issue politically, but also content-wise of mixing those is really the law enforcement sector. And personally, and also speaking now for MEP Axel Voss and also many other policymakers here in the parliament, it would have been preferable to really split law enforcement and the rest of the AI Act, similar to actually the GDPR, where you have the data protection law for basically everything, and then you have additional law enforcement directive, which is covering data protection for law enforcement agencies. Because yes, the question is already indicating it. There are a lot of differences between private and public authorities. Or private companies and public authorities, but especially when it comes to law enforcement, there are maybe some things that we do not see as problematic when it's about, I don't know, certain commercial uses of AI technologies. But if law enforcement agencies are using those technologies in a certain way, maybe it's not in line with our European values and probably also not with the US values.
Thanks, Kai. Christina, you want to?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in to say that I think importantly, this is an area where government can be as leaders and act as examples by, adopting trustworthy AI procurement practices initially to help set, because the government's a huge purchaser of technology in general. And there's so much fundamental opportunity within government, given the vast amounts of data that they manage, silos across governments and the like. There's such an opportunity for government to use this technology to help transform and provide better digital services and the like. So I think government acting as an example, leading the way in things like adopting sort of the NIST risk management framework as a lens potentially toward procurement and the like could be a real opportunity to lead in this area.
Max, do you want to say anything on this point, or we have tons of other questions?
No, I think they both captured it well. You need to have maybe separate implementations for law enforcement and military use cases, and B, that the public sector really can lead on this by example. I think those are exactly what I would have said.
Right, great. Okay, I see another good question there. How from Mirai, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How can global AI governance be aligned across different regions? What are the similarities across different values in AI policymaking in the US, Europe, China? How can global AI policymaking play out on country, state, and city levels? Okay, so that's quite broad, but it's true. You see initiatives at national level, you see discussions at the OECD, the G7, at the UN. So we have a very fertile international conversation. Well, are we going to have alignment, especially when it comes to governance, general principles? What do you make of all these conversations globally?
So I'll jump in to start. I think alignment, obviously, as a global company with operations in 170 countries around the world, we strive for as much alignment as possible. I think alignment provides clarity. Certainly, the technology is one that's going to cross country borders and is already crossing country borders. So I think alignment as much as possible is absolutely the way to bring the safest, most responsible AI to market, to help the most people around the world. And we're not that far apart when you think about the fundamental principles, like the OECD principles around trustworthy and responsible AI, which form the foundation for a lot of the frameworks we're seeing implemented by various countries and governments around the world today. Were established a few years back. Companies have aligned to them, largely governments have aligned to them, general concepts about transparency, as much explainability, fairness in AI, human-centered AI, human oversight of AI systems, that AI should augment humans and the like. So we're not as far away as it might sound. I think that ultimately different jurisdictions will take different approaches because they have different legislative models. So some may be more prescriptive or more sort of this distinction between, voluntary or driven by mandatory regulations. But if the framework is essentially consistent, that is absolutely optimal, both for the companies who are creating and deploying AI and ultimately for the users who want to ensure that the AI that is being used around the globe is responsible and trustworthy.
Max, Kai, do you want to jump in on this one?
In addition to what Christina said, which I completely agree with, that the most important thing is to align at the level of the principles and the frameworks and allow individual implementations to differ. I'll also add that, as I was kind of hinting at before, we need to have a fair amount of humility about our governance of foundation models and how that's going to evolve, especially if foundation models underpin an increasingly large section or segment of the AI industry as a whole, which remains to be seen. And so that humility means that I think that each nation or state entity that implements rules in this is probably going to have different opinions on that. And for now, I think that that's actually appropriate because we don't really have consensus on what the right approach is there. And it's important for us to have a dialogue and try to build consensus where possible, but also acknowledge that this is a very complicated subject and one that not everyone is going to agree on the best path going forward. And we might actually benefit from some sort of democracy of governance to see which approaches work well and which don't. And that's going to create a little bit of challenges at the beginning, but until we learn more about how to govern this technology, I think it's appropriate for us to have some differences in implementation as we try different things out and see how they work.
Thanks, Max. Anything you want to add to that, Kai, or you're in agreement?
Yeah, I'm basically in complete agreement. I also would have referred to the OECD principles because I think especially those were really groundbreaking in a way that they were based on a common understanding by a lot of countries that are now starting in whatever way to think about, let's call it AI policy. And it's really good that we have this kind of common principle, common understanding. And one maybe example I can bring from the AI Act where it's going in a similar direction is with the AI definition. There are hundreds of different definitions. No definition is perfect that we saw. And this is why in the end we said, okay, let's do the same like our colleagues in the United States. The NIST AI definition is based on 2019 OECD recommendation. Let's take that one. And I think this is a good way forward, at least on those basic things, to have a kind of agreement among each other. It will help if we all have a similar definition, for example, on what is AI.
Thanks, Kai. Okay, see another question here on foundation models, maybe for you, Max, and maybe Christina too. Is the EU approach on foundation models likely to be an inspiration for the US approach?
I'll just briefly restate what I said in my last answer, which is I think we're very grateful that we've had the opportunity to see the EU go through this process and learn from the process that they're going through to understand this complex subject that is evolving right before our eyes, as we're also trying to think about what the governance principles are. And so I do think we will learn a lot from what the EU is doing in this area. I don't know, frankly, whether it's fair to say that the US approach will mirror the EU approach or reflect that. I think there's a lot of negotiation left that we have to do in Congress in this area and in the administration to figure out what we mean by regulating foundation models or governing foundation models. And so I think we will learn, but it's a little bit too soon to say what the final product will be and how much it will reflect the EU's position.
Okay, great. Quite a few questions on the European approach to foundation models, which is tricky to navigate sometimes. It's true. So maybe I pick this one for you, Kai. Does a DSA approach mean 45 million users for foundation models to qualify as systemic risk, as proposed by the presidency?
Yeah,
I think this is a reference to the Spanish presidency, but I think it was about general purpose AI, and it's true sometimes.
Yes,
it's the proposal on general purpose AI other than foundation models, a bit confusing.
Yeah, exactly. This, I think, was actually also another question that was being put in the chat. So maybe I can answer them together. First of all, what the person from the chat is referring to is not really the position by the Council of the European Union, but it's a non-paper that was drafted within the negotiations by a certain actor, let's say, and this non-paper was then sent to the council delegation, so to the other member states, in order to give them a little bit input and initiate a debate. This debate is necessary because, as you rightly said, we have different definitions, different terms. The council is talking about general purpose, we about foundation models. The common understanding right now in the European Union is that foundation model is GPT-4, so really the baseline model, and a general purpose AI system would be kind of ChatGPT, so the application which is already more downstream and at least a little bit more narrow. And this 45 million threshold was indeed in this non-paper working paper for general purpose AI systems. So for ChatGPT, one of the thresholds. I think in general, again, even though we are now calling it a DSA-like approach, we will not take any or almost any criteria from the DSA or any thresholds or even from the DMA, Digital Market Act, because those thresholds would not really make sense for the AI Act. So we will very likely have our own thresholds to define this. I use now my term for this certain type of foundation models. As I said, I call them systemic foundation models. I think thresholds for those systemic foundation models could be a combination of compute, maybe kind of investments, very, very general, the kind of capabilities to learn new tasks, to perform certain tasks, also maybe the size of the company, size or number of employees, etc., etc. So it's really it should be a lot of different criteria that are being taken into account by the Commission, who are making the designation of those systemic foundation models, because one criteria is not enough. So for example, compute, which was in this paper as the only criteria, is already outdated, as we all know, because there's, for example, this foundation model GACO from DeepMind, which is not using a lot of compute and would not reach this threshold, even though it's a rather powerful foundation model. So we have a lot of work on this part, I think, still ahead.
Thanks, Kai. Would love to continue the conversation, but we're at the top of the hour here for our event. So I really want to thank you, Christina, Kai, Max, for the great discussion. Thanks to our audience. There were many of you today. Thanks for the great questions. If you want to know more about the Policy Lab and our activities, you can go to ibm.com/policy. And the discussion goes on, of course, on AI across the world. Thank you all for today's event. Thank you.